So, hello, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of the EMEA Recruitment Podcast in partnership with our good friends over at Operation Smile. As my colleague Rose mentioned, we're delighted to welcome Daniel Pink onto the podcast today. So, really great to hear and see you today, Daniel. Hope you're okay.
I'm good, Paul. Thanks for having me on the show.
Perfect. No, really delighted and looking forward to having the conversation with you. We've got a good list of questions, actually, some of which have come from my colleagues here at EMEA, and then some have come from our external network, because I think everyone was quite excited to welcome you as a guest on today. So the pressure is on me to give you a challenging interview today. So fingers crossed I can do that. But
all right, I'm ready.
Well, I guess, to start off with, in a light-hearted manner, as I mentioned there, the show is in connection with Operation Smile. And in case you don't know who they are, they're a charity that help children who are born in developing countries where they have issues with cleft lip and palate. And I thought, to try and put a smile on people's faces and to ease you into the podcast, I just thought I'd ask you what the last thing was that made you smile, Daniel.
I think it was a couple of days ago when our older son, who just started at university, came back for the winter holidays, and just seeing him definitely made me smile. He's the kind of person who brightens every room that he's in, which makes me always wonder how he's even related to me.
It's always good. I know on your LinkedIn profile you mentioned that you're very family orientated, and I know we're speaking today in your home in Washington, and I suppose obviously with all the COVID stuff it's put paid to a bit of the Christmas plans, but it's still great that your son's managed to get back. Do you have any plans for the Christmas period?
No, we have my wife and I have three kids. We live in Washington, D.C. All of them live in different places in the United States, and each of them is coming for a few days, and there's a small overlap for a few days where everybody's going to be here. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to do what I always do, which is wake up in the morning and come into my office, which is the garage behind my house.
Well, I know obviously this home office room is where all the magic has happened. I know you've got your new book coming out in the new year, The Power of Regret, which obviously we're going to talk about shortly. But speaking of writing and famous authors, someone that has inspired myself and actually the business model for EMEA is Simon Sinek, who I'm sure you've heard of, and who wrote Start With Why. And I thought I'd ask you really, what got you into writing in the first place? What was the motivation to start off in this field at the beginning of everything?
Yeah, it was sort of a discovery I made over many, many years. I did not start out with the intention of becoming a writer. I kind of came into it, but what happened from the time that I was in university to the time that I was in graduate school to the time that I was actually working at jobs, I was always quote unquote writing on the side. So I did it as kind of like a hobby. I would write newspaper op-eds or articles and things like that. And I did it because I liked doing it. And it finally occurred to me in my early 30s that what I was doing on the side is what I should be doing, in the center. And I think what I like about it is that I think the biggest part of it for me is that I like to figure stuff out. And the way that I do it, for better or worse, is that writing is a form of thinking. A lot of times I think people think that writing is, exactly what you're going to say, and all you do is sit down at your desk and execute it. But for me, the act of writing is the act of thinking and figuring stuff out, and that's what I like. That's what I ultimately like to do. The other thing about it is, if you're writing nonfiction, if you're writing the kind of books that I do, if you're writing the kind of articles that I don't write so much of now, but did in the past, is that you just get to reach out to people and ask them questions and learn stuff, and they pay you for it, and it's pretty cool.
That's it, and as you say, you enjoy it. It's you see it as a cool thing to do, and I guess that's why it feels more of a vocation than a job. Would you say because of that?
No, it's somewhere in between. Because writing is really, really hard, and it's like when I'm writing a book, to come into this office every day and have that cursor blinking at me, mocking me for my stupidity and laziness, and see that every single day, and to write first drafts that are awful that I would never want to see. So it's really hard. I think that most things that people do that are valuable, they do because they have a sense of purpose about them, and they're moments of transcendence. But much of what we do to create valuable things can be a grind, and you have to actually, I think even beyond tolerating the grind, you have to actually relish it in some ways.
Mm-hmm. No, that's it. I mean, I think obviously you mentioned there, you've got a purpose about the writing, and something that's you can see is going to add value to the readers at the end of the day. And I guess the something that would be really good to explore is the Power of Regret book that is coming out fairly soon, that you've written in that very room. So maybe you can explain to the listeners how the idea of the Power of Regret actually came around.
Well, it came around because I realized that I had some regrets myself. And I think what's mildly interesting about this book, and going to your earlier question, Paul, about writing, is that, we are different. I don't want to get all woo-woo on you, but we are different people at different times of our life. And this is not a book I would have written in my 30s. It is a book, though, that somehow felt inevitable in my 50s. Because I was at that point in my life where I had plenty of stuff behind me, but also plenty of stuff ahead of me. And as I look backward, I realize there are some things like, if only I had been smarter about this, if only I hadn't done that, if only I had been kinder, if only I'd taken more risks. And it really got me thinking about that. And when I started talking to people about it, I found them, and I did it somewhat sheepishly, I found them really leaning in. It's a topic that people wanted to really talk about. And that's always a good sign for a writer, that if I had curiosity about a topic and other people shared my curiosity, that was usually promising material.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with that, because I agree. I mean, I've read a few books on regrets that people have over the years, and I think it's there's one called "Regrets of the Dying" by a lady called Bronnie Ware,
Right.
an Australian author, and I think it is one of those things that I think actually, as you say, people can relate to. People, it's something people want to read about. I mean, how did you find? I guess it's quite an emotional subject to bring up. I can imagine that people would be quite emotional talking about these types of things. So, how was it as the person sort of interviewing individuals on what's quite an emotional subject, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you make a good point, because it is, my previous books have been in some ways big idea books. And this one is in some ways a big emotion book. It's a book about one of our most prevalent emotions, one of human beings' most prevalent emotions. If you look at some of the research, regret is our most common negative emotion. And it's our one of our most common emotions of any kind. And what I found, though, is that when you invite people to talk about it, many of them are not hesitant at all. They really want to open up about it. And there's some interesting evidence showing that when we talk about our regrets, that very act of disclosure, it makes us feel a little bit better. And so what I found myself doing, and I'll take a step back, I found myself having incredibly rich and candid, vulnerable conversations with people around the world. So what I did, again, now to backtrack a little bit, is that as part of the research, I set up something called the World Regrets Survey, where I invited people to contribute their regrets. And in a very brief amount of time, we collected over 16,000 regrets from people in 105 countries. It's really extraordinary. And about 30% of the people opted in to share their email address and be contacted for interviews, which is to me was a very high number. And so people want to talk about this, and people want to unburden themselves. And people, I think that regret has had too much of a stigma, especially here in the United States, where we have this insidious, wrong-headed, dangerous philosophy of no regrets. This idea that we should have no regrets. No, I don't have any regrets. No regrets. No regrets. And that, there's 40 or 50 years of science on regret. And what it tells us pretty clearly is that everybody has regrets. The only people who don't have regrets are 5-year-olds, people with brain damage, and sociopaths. Everybody else has regrets. Regrets make us human. And there's also evidence from the science showing that if we treat them right, if we reckon with our regrets properly, they can make us better too. They can deliver an array of benefits to our decision making, to our performance on academic and professional tasks, and they can also deepen our sense of meaning. So, in my view, regret is our most misunderstood emotion. And strangely, for a negative emotion, it actually gives us the clarity and the instruction to find a good life.
Mm-hmm. I mean, not to give too many spoilers away, but were there any particular ones that stood out to you, would you say? I mean, if there was maybe one that you would highlight as a very inspirational regret.
Well, I mean, just categorically, one of the most interesting things is the number of regrets people have about boldness. And this comes up in the academic research too. It came up in my own research. I also did a very large public opinion poll of the U.S. population, where this also came up pretty clearly. And what the evidence shows is that people are much more likely to regret what they didn't do than what they did do. That regrets of inaction significantly outnumber regrets of action. And within that broad group of inaction regrets, there are a huge numbers of regrets about boldness. And to me, what's interesting is that a lot of these regrets transcend the domains of life. We often will think about regrets as like, oh, I have an education regret or a career regret or a health regret. And what I found is that beneath those domains of life, there's a deep structure of regret. And one of the core regrets that people have are regrets about boldness. So let me be specific here. I have, Paul, no joke, hundreds of regrets around the world that go like this. X years ago, I met a man/woman whom I really liked. I wanted to ask him, her out, but I didn't, and I've regretted it ever since. Right? That's a romance regret, but it's a regret of boldness. But at the same time, I have regrets, huge numbers of regrets, again, around the world, that are regrets about staying in a lackluster job rather than starting a business. People not taking an entrepreneurial risk. I have some people who regret taking that entrepreneurial risk. I regret I started a business and it went out and it went under and I lost a lot of money and I shouldn't have done that. But for every one of those, I probably have 20 or 25 of people who have the reverse regret, which is like, oh, I didn't take the risk. Huge numbers of regrets in this boldness category about speaking up. It really blew me away. People said, I wanted to say something, but I didn't have the guts to say something. Whether it's at a meeting, whether it's on the job, whether it's about some kind of injustice. And so to me, it's what we end up regretting is not taking the risk. That our regrets about taking risks are relatively small, not non-existent, but they're outnumbered by huge factor. Literally, I think it's truly like a factor of 20 or 25 of people who regret not taking the chance.
Mm-hmm. No, it's really interesting. I mean, I guess when you were doing your sort of research into this, because you tend to find that typically people are very influenced by the people around them or they're speaking to the most at any one time. So did you find yourself slipping into a very risk-free, carefree individual because you were speaking to people about their regrets all the time? You thought, okay, I can't have any regrets in my life. I've got to make sure I make the most of every minute. I mean, that must have been quite a challenging journey.
It's interesting you say that because it did. I mean, this book really did make me reflect a lot on my own life. And I do feel like I haven't taken enough risks. I haven't taken enough chances myself. And I don't want to get to, assuming I live for a long, another 40 years or so, knock wood, I don't want to look back 40 years from this point and say, I wish I had taken the risk. I do feel it made me reflect that I haven't taken enough risks for someone, like me who both has that desire and has had that, and has that privilege. So, but it's also true. It's also true of other things. There are a lot of regrets about connections, and again, connections to other people. It doesn't matter what the connection is. So it could be spouses, it could be parents to children, children to parents, siblings, friends, incredibly important in people's lives, as research is telling me, colleagues, and so forth. And what happens a lot of times is that we have relationships, and they come apart. And what was interesting to me, looking at these 16,000 regrets, is that these relationships didn't come apart in dramatic ways. They were drifts, not rifts. And what happened is people drifted apart, whether it's whoever, a lot of friendships drift apart. Nobody wants to reach out because they say, oh, it's going to feel really awkward if I reach out, and the other side is not going to care. And we're wrong on both fronts. Both my reporting and a pile of academic research says that it's a lot less awkward than you think, and it's almost always welcome. And so another lesson for me as a human being is the importance of reaching out. I have not reached out enough. I've had friendships and relationships that didn't endure, not because there was any problem, not because there was any kind of blow up or anything like that. It's just like life happened, you drifted apart. And I've always kind of said, oh, I should probably reach out. And I never done it because I was too much of a wimp, and I thought it was going to be awkward, and I thought they weren't going to care. And it turns out I'm completely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
No, and I have a lot of stories in the book. I have a lot of stories in the book, or several big stories in the book, of people who were reckoning with those kinds of core connection regrets.
No, I think it's really interesting because I know that there's a lot being talked about in the media at the moment about mental health for men specifically, because
interesting.
And I think that's one of the areas that on the friendship side that you do tend to find women are stronger at keeping in touch with their friends as they get older, whereas as men seem to become more and more distant, and then it just causes mentally.
It's actually a really good point. I wish I had sort of written something about that. And to the extent to the men in your audience, it's really important to push past that awkwardness and that discomfort and reach out. It's going to feel better than you think, and it's going to be received with much more gusto and appreciation than you imagine. Mm-hmm. And it's the other thing about it. I mean, again, for when thinking about it from the workplace and thinking about it from the recruiting side, there are a lot of people who regret not having closer connection to work colleagues. I have one person in the book, it's a very sad regret, who talks about how he'd been working at this place for 30 years, and he realized that he didn't consider any of his coworkers really good friends. And he realized that he missed out on that. And one of the things that you see is that these regrets, not only do they give us guidance about what matters in our lives, but they also, I think, give organizations guidance for what people actually value. My argument here, Paul, is that if we understand what people regret the most, and I think we do now, if we understand what people regret the most, we also understand what they value the most. It's sort of a photographic negative of what people value the most. And what people value the most, over and over again, really across nations, across genders, across age, are the same basic things. And those things, a strong foundation, a chance to take risks, doing the right thing, and close connections, are also the elements of a strong and coherent corporate culture. And so, regret gives us clues about how to navigate our lives, but it also gives us clues about how to build satisfying, rich organizations.
No, it's really true. And you see a lot of companies now putting a lot of emphasis in this area. I mean, especially with the remote working being so prevalent at the moment, but it's trying to find ways to keep the team together, whether it's, virtual online games or, events like wine tasting. I had a client in Switzerland who had, virtual wine tasting organized by a company and had that as a team event. But it's those kind of things that, not everybody likes those kind of things, but even if you connect with, 20-30% of the people in that room, it's better than none at all. So I think that's all of this is very relevant, especially to what companies are trying to find a solution to, given that all the remote working going on right now as well. And I guess
the other thing more broadly, and I know that you've done stuff on this, is that we spend half of our waking lives on the job, and so if we know what people want out of their lives, we know what they want out of the half that they spend working. And so a lot of these things, and you've seen this trajectory, a lot of these things that we never wanted to talk about in the organizational context, in the workplace context, things like purpose, things like vulnerability. We realize that if we actually let them in, it strengthens our organizations. It doesn't undermine it. And I feel the same thing is true with regret. If we as individuals reckon with our regrets, if we learn that regret is a photographic negative of the good life, and organizations actually lean into regret a little bit, I actually think they're going to be stronger organizations.
No, it's true, and I think there's not many people that I think disagree with what we're saying. I think the biggest challenge is going from agreeing to this is the right way, but actually getting the courage or the changing approach to take action on it. That's often the biggest challenge, I guess, is actually listening to something and realizing it's right to then taking action on it. And it's a reason why this book that's coming out is probably, timing wise, is probably the best time it probably could have hit the market, so given everything that we're going through right now.
We'll see.
Yeah. Now, I know you mentioned earlier on about how this book is a bit of a move away from some of the previous work you'd done on work and creativity and the human condition. So I know we talked a bit about how you got into writing in the first place, but why was it specifically, let's say, the field of science and human motivation that really interested you?
I've always been interested in what made people tick. In university, I was a social science major. I majored in linguistics, which is a very kind of mathematical social science. My very first term in university, I took psychology. I always was very interested in that. I think that, if I had navigated things a little bit differently, I probably would have ended up becoming a professor. But I was much more professional, more traditional, more risk averse when I was younger, and that seemed like not a great option. So it's something that I've always been keenly interested in, and I don't have a PhD. I'm not a professor. I'm not a scholar. There's a downside to that, but I also feel like for me there's an upside, because so much of the academic world is very siloed, very cabined. So not only do you not have, and I saw this in one book that I wrote about timing, not only do you, like The Economist until recently never talked to the psychologists, the anthropologists typically haven't been talking to the economists. The people doing molecular biology are not talking to the people doing sociology, and there are commonalities, there are bridges among all these disciplines, and so for a non-specialist can navigate those things, doesn't see those distinctions in the way that an academic does. I mean, you have in the field of psychology, you have like developmental psychologists, don't really care what personality psychologists are doing, and who don't really care about what social psychologists are doing, and so they don't care what cognitive psychologists are doing. So even in that world of psychology, you have mini silos within the mega silo. And so for someone like me, what I found is interesting is that just calling up an economist and saying, "Hey, I'm not an economist, explain it to me." Or calling up an anthropologist and saying, "Hey, I'm not an anthropologist, explain it to me." Or calling up a biologist and say, "I'm not a biologist, explain it to me."
So it's just having that that network that you're able to reach out to and speak to, and trying to get the most from the network that you had, and that helps in the move in that direction of science and motivation.
I think so, because I mean, for that particular. For that book, so the book I wrote about motivation, called Drive, that I had I was curious about sort of like what motivated people on the job, because I'd written a previous book that talked about some changes in the way that sort of the skills that people were needed on the job. And I started looking at some of the research on motivation and found that it was like, it said some really surprising things. And I was like, what the heck? Why don't people know this? And for that one, I spent, I was fortunate. I spent some time with a bunch of well-known behavioral scientists, but two of them were fellows, a guy named Ed Deasy and Richard Ryan, formerly of University of Rochester. I went up to Rochester and talked to them and said, okay, guys, I've read a lot of your papers. They seem to be a big deal. Why aren't they getting more attention? Does it say this? Does it say that? Can you explain it to me? I had a lovely time interviewing a fellow named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who passed away recently. He was the father of the concept of flow. And so, I didn't become a scientist, but I really enjoy talking to scientists. And one reason I enjoy talking to scientists is that most of them are really into what they do. Like, they're really into it. And, it's always fun to talk to people who are enthusiastic about what they're working on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, you're talking to people of all these different walks of life on a regular basis. I mean, would you say that one of your key strengths as a prolific writer is actually listening? Because you're able to take on board all this information and then translate it into your books. So, I mean, would you say that one of the strengths of a great writer is the listening element to it?
I think so. I think it's partly listening. I think it's partly also just generally being, curious about other people and what they have to say. And those two things go together. So if I'm curious about what someone has to say, I'm going to ask them some questions and I'm going to shut up and listen. And so I think that it's a mix of those kinds of things. I also think there's something to be said for just being willing to tell people that you don't understand something and can they explain it to you? Or you say, hey, a lot of times I'll do interviews and say, okay, so I'm a little confused. Like, I'm trying to work out this issue. What do you think? And we just have a conversation about that. And that's, I really enjoy that part of it. I like that more than writing. I like shooting the breeze much more than writing. It's a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting. And earlier on, I know you mentioned you had the interest in linguistics as well, and sort of bridging that gap between that and the recruitment world at the moment. I know that there's a big push for companies to write gender neutral job descriptions now, and LinkedIn have this algorithm which will have male and female language within the job profiles, and it's something that years ago could never have imagined would have been around. But you do see the linguistics and the corporate world and recruitment all merging together now.
I mean, one thing that there is an element of politics in linguistics that we often don't see. We don't see on the surface. So if you think about questions about what is a country's, and this is a bigger deal in Europe, although it's become a bigger deal here in the United States, is what is a country's national language. So if what is the official language of a country? That's a purely political. It's somewhat pragmatic decision, but it's largely a political decision. It's a decision in some ways about identity. And at the same time, one of the really, I think, remarkable things that you're saying, again, showing how language gives us a window into how the world is changing, is exactly what you're saying, Paul, about pronouns. You see in Argentina, there is Spanish has masculine and feminine pronouns, él and ella, and now there's a third pronoun that some young Argentine Spanish speakers are using that is neither feminine nor masculine. French has the emergence of a gender neutral third person pronoun. So of course in France all hell has broken loose over that. But again, one of the reasons I like studying linguistics is that arguably what makes languages is what makes us human. It's what we do better than any other species. Arguably, we're the only. It's confusing, but we're arguably the only species that has this incredible capacity for language. So in some ways, it defines who we are as human beings. And so if you understand language in all of its dimensions, you begin to understand who human beings are. That's why linguistics is so exciting.
Mm. I mean, it must give you a bit of quite a buzz, actually, given that it is becoming more of a topic that is discussed a lot more commonly now. Whereas, I guess, when you were looking into it, it wasn't, maybe that publicly well known. So it must be.
Yeah. Well, the other thing about it is that's interesting. And again, I don't want to empty the room in this podcast by spending the whole time talking about linguistics. I mean, I do want to talk about linguistics the whole time. But the other thing that's happening, which is a sea change from the time that I was studying linguistics as an undergraduate, is the depth of computational power that we can bring to bear on these things. So even things like when I was doing research in linguistics, I would do tape recordings of people's conversations and then sit down and transcribe them. And now you have what's essentially automatic transcription that's not perfect, but is really good. I mean, really good. You have now Google Translate is actually not bad. I mean, it used to be horrible, and it keeps becoming less and less not bad. You have now even, if you think about something as rudimentary as when I'm on my phone and I'm texting, and the texting program will suggest the word that comes next, that is linguistic. That's computational linguistics right there. So it's everywhere, Paul. Linguistics is everywhere.
There's no escaping it. That's it. And I'm just going, I suppose, moving it back onto the subject of your books more generally. I thought I'd just ask you maybe quite a general question in terms of what group of people do you think are going to benefit from your next book the most, would you say? Because as we talked about, it's such an emotive subject that I guess could cross a whole range of demographic. But is there a particular demographic you had in mind when you were writing it, or?
No, I very rarely have a particular demographic in mind. I'm not that strategic. I say, my view is that if I find something interesting, chances are other people find it interesting because I'm not that special. And so I think that this, I think that this book will reach people at different stages of their life. So I think that younger people will look at that and say, okay, wait a second. You got all these people with regrets. How do I avoid that? How do I anticipate those regrets? I think you have people like me who are in the middle of life saying, okay, I've made some mistakes. I've got some regrets. How do I transform those into a positive force for the rest of my life? And then I think you have older people who say, oh, the clock is ticking. What can I do in the remaining years to do something? But also equally important, how can I use my own regrets to give advice to other people? How can I use my own regrets as a positive legacy of guidance and counsel and advice to others?
No, that's true. I mean, I think it's one of those things that, as I say, having looked at some of the posts you put on LinkedIn quite recently, I imagine these are sort of clips from the book that is about to come out, and I think you look at them and think, they are inspiring in their own right. These two or three lines of information, I mean, they do make you think and take a moment to pause and reflect on things. So it's I think I'm looking forward to this book coming out and hearing what all the reviews are going to say and so on. And I think we mentioned about there's no escaping linguistics. But I was wondering, is there going to be any escaping Daniel Pink next year? Because obviously you've got the book coming out. I noticed you're very active on LinkedIn. I know obviously you can't travel too much at the moment, but have you got quite a busy agenda in terms of promoting the book and getting out and about quite a bit?
We're working that out right now. I will be coming to the UK to promote the book, and we have sold rights in several European languages. I'm not sure when those books are actually going to be out there. So I'll be out talking to anybody who'll listen.
Mm. Well, I think there'll be a good long queue of that of those types of people, Daniel. So I don't think you're going to need to worry about that side of things. And I thought I'd just end the podcast with a couple of maybe slightly unusual questions. Really,
Okay.
I know we started on a relatively humorous one, so just a few lighthearted ones to end with. Because I mean, we see with the people we speak to in this podcast series that most really successful people surround themselves with other successful people, and they become the total of the people they spend the time with. So I wondered if there's any particular individuals who've really stood out to you as mentors in your life. If there was one or two that you would name who've had a big impact on you.
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that question, because one of my regrets is that I actually never really fostered that kind of mentorship relationship with anybody. I think that I was a bad mentee, and it was something that I wasn't seeking and didn't value. And in retrospect, I wish I had done that. So instead of having, a single mentor or two, I've ended up, learning small things, very small things from different people whom I've encountered. But in retrospect, I'd love to have had somebody who played more of a mentor role in my life. I really didn't.
Mm. What I just out of interest, what was the reason you felt you were possibly a bad mentee?
Because I think there's a few things. Number one is that I wasn't really looking for a mentor. I didn't really even understand the concept, so it wasn't something that I was seeking and trying to develop. The other thing is that earlier in my life, I was I think I was much too certain about everything. I didn't know what I didn't know, and so I operated based on a set of assumptions that I never really challenged about how the world worked. And a good mentor could have said, "Hey, Dan, it doesn't work that way. Let's look at it let's look at it another way." Mm-hmm. So, but again, truly, it's like it's not my top regret, but it is a regret that I have, that I never developed anywhere close to a mentor relationship with anybody.
Okay. No, well, that's interesting. I think you might be the first person.
And that's a mistake. That's a mistake. I hope that your listeners learn from. I hope your listeners learn from that. And that's in the sense that look to others to keep your mind open and look to others to give you guidance. And if you find somebody who is giving you good guidance, who you share a set of values with, that can be a very rich and meaningful relationship.
Mm-hmm. No, I guess that because the last question I had was actually probably quite related to this, given your answer. I mean, I was going to ask you if you were to host a podcast with anybody that you'd like to, whether it's historically or someone that's around today. What two guests would you choose? Because I guess now
living or dead.
Get some mentoring.
Oh wow! I got that one. I got that one immediately. Okay. Jesus and Muhammad.
Okay, that's
not even close. I think I'd like to talk to them and say, hey, you realize that these things you started are still around. In Jesus' case, over 2,000 years later. In Muhammad's case, not quite 2,000 years later, and have been a force in the world in ways that you might not recognize and might not endorse. Let's have a round table to talk about it. Totally. Yeah. That's an easy one, Paul.
Yeah. No, I like it. You're giving very different answers to those last two questions to some of the other guests. So it's really, really, really interesting on that side. Not what I expected either. So no, it's really good. So it's well, I mean, all that's left for me to say is a huge thanks.
How are people answering that question? What are they saying? Winston Churchill or?
Well, yeah, we've had not him necessarily him, but we've had some of the usual things like Bill Gates and Richard Branson and Oprah Winfrey.
You said living or dead.
Yeah. That's it. Can be anybody, So yours have definitely been the biggest names. I would say that's the most ambitious.
I think that Jesus is a little bit bigger than Richard Branson.
Yeah, he might disagree, but
that's true. He might disagree.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's been great to have you as a guest on the podcast today, Daniel. I really appreciate it because I know you're really full on, very busy. So to get this time with you has been amazing. I mean, obviously, if the network wants to reach out to you, what's the best way they can do that?
Just check out my website, which is www.danpink.com. Everything that you would want to know about me or how to find me is there.
Perfect. That sounds great. And obviously, well, hopefully we'll see you in person in the UK when you're able to travel and promote the book.
I hope so.
With a bit of luck. So, yeah, look forward to it. But yeah, huge thanks again, Daniel. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.